"I don't give a damn what black people like you do, Washington. This is Pinewood Grove, and here I am the law," Hans roared, his eyes wild and bloodshot as he looked at Ven like he was just a stray rat daring to wander into his territory. Hans's other hand swung up swiftly, his fist hard as an iron hammer, crashing into Ven's forehead. Blood began to trickle, slowly at first, then pouring in a thick streak down to the corner of his eye. But what Hans didn't expect was that the man before him had once been a strategic advisor to the Department of Defense. "Where are you living? If the place you call home is one where the law only comes from the mouth of the strongest, what would you do?" Ven Washington placed his suitcase neatly by his feet, his eyes scanning the small bus station at the edge of town. The dark suit he wore was pressed sharply to every fold. The cuffs still marked faintly from the military uniform he had just taken off before stepping down from the vehicle. A gentle breeze rustled through the roadside trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and an old air that he thought he had left behind many years ago. A rusty sign, Pinewood Grove, where every memory begins, hung wavering on the station's awning, swaying gently with the passage of time. No one recognized the middle-aged man who once commanded thousands of soldiers at forward bases in Afghanistan. No one knew he had sat in the Pentagon's conference room, presenting strategic plans to counter cross-border threats, and received a medal personally from the Secretary of Defense last autumn. That moment remained etched in his memory like a brief, straightforward film. No extravagance, just a firm handshake, appropriate praise, and the steady applause of uniformed personnel below the auditorium. Yet now, he had returned not for honor, but for one person alone, his mother. The old station, the red dirt road leading to the residential area, and the unfamiliar looks he received when entering the first convenience store all felt like a discordant tune. The shop was closing early. The elderly owner kept her distance, glancing at him when he asked to buy a bottle of water and some cold medicine. "We don't accept cash after 9, she said, even though the clock behind her showed only 8. Ven did not argue. He nodded, took his wallet, and stepped outside. On the narrow sidewalk, a young man in sportswear brushed hard against him as he passed. Ven's shoulder was pushed askew, and his arm instinctively tightened slightly. The youth did not stop or apologize, only smirked faintly. Ven stood still, turned around, then let it be. His eyes, which had once witnessed blood and fire, were now as cold as still water. A police car was parked across the street. Inside sat a young officer, straight-backed with hands on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on Ven. No expression, no greeting. That look spoke volumes without words. Ven turned away, gripping his bag's handle tightly. A familiar feeling surged, not from the battlefield but from youthful days when he had been questioned for standing outside a white friend's house, asked to leave a bookstore because he didn't look like someone who could buy anything there. He turned onto a small TJ junction, a road leading south of town where his mother's old house still nestled between two abandoned yards. The wind blew through his collar, the scent of wild grass and thyme hitting his nose. Pinewood Grove no longer smelled of baked goods and dry straw like before. Now it was heavy, silent, a moment suspended between stillness and vigilance. Ven slowed as he neared the street's end. There was something in his step, not exactly fatigue, but a sharp pang felt when returning to a place where one no longer belonged. He raised his head, shoulders still straight, chin slightly lifted, yet his eyes gradually quieted. Pinewood Grove had changed, and he knew he hadn't just come back to care for his aging mother. Another front awaited him, right in the place called home. The wooden house at the road's end, shaded by an oak tree, remained as weathered as in Ven's memory. The faded metal roof, the creaking wooden steps beneath each footfall, and the crooked sign, "God Bless This Home," hanging askew on the porch, its letters worn by time but still there, like a stubborn prayer clinging to a world changing colors. Yellow light spilled from a small window, making the house appear as a fragile beacon amid the gloomy town. Mrs. Lucille sat in an old rocking chair, hands clasped on her lap. When the door opened, her eyes brightened. She looked thinner than the last time Ven had seen her, her face deeply lined with time's folds, but her smile remained whole. Ven bent down to embrace his mother. She squeezed his hand gently, her breath short but her gaze proud. "My son has returned," she whispered. Ven answered with a small smile. Neither needed many words. The 15 years of absence filled that moment. Dinner was simple, cornbread and bean soup. Under warm yellow light, Ven spoke about his days working in Washington, while Mrs. Lucille nodded occasionally, interjecting a few questions before quietly observing her son. As the meal neared its end, she half-joked, half-stated, "They don't see you as a hero here anymore, Ven." Ven took a sip of water, setting the glass down slowly. "I didn't come back to be called that." She smiled faintly, eyes scanning the kitchen window. "People only see skin color now. Kids here get pushed down on the sidewalks, then asked for papers. Passing the center wearing a hoodie means being watched. The kids have to go everywhere in pairs these days. Alone means trouble." Ven fell silent. From where he sat, he could clearly see the street through the kitchen glass. A group of police officers was searching an old car. There was no accident, no collision. A young black man stood with his hands on his head, eyes lowered to the ground. The scene reminded Ven of civil control tactical training long ago, only here there was no reason, no explanation, just silence and control. The grocery store at the street's start, where he once bought his first peppermint candy, had now been replaced by a brightly lit convenience store with LED lights. Mr. Lewis, with his gentle smile, was gone, replaced by anti-theft warnings plastered thick across the glass. Cameras were mounted in all four corners, casting a chilling atmosphere inside and out. The town kept its old name, but its soul had vanished long ago. After dinner, Ven stepped into the living room. The altar for his father sat in the right corner, beside an old wedding photo. He placed his hand on the wooden frame, gently brushing away a thin layer of dust. The picture showed a man in a white shirt, his calm face carrying a quiet pride in his eyes. Years ago, his father had said, "Keep going, son. You must return, not to live, but to set an example." Back then, Ven had not fully understood. Now, in this cold town, he began to grasp every word. The wind chime outside the porch suddenly rang, its gentle tinkling like a reminder. Ven turned his head and straightened up. He wore no rank, had no unit, and no weapon, yet his heart was not empty. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow I will start again, from here." Ven walked briskly along the narrow sidewalk, his hand gently gripping the handle of a paper bag containing fever medicine and some miscellaneous items for his mother. The sky was dimming, and the yellow street lights cast long shadows from the ancient tree canopies. The wind rustled through the warped Wexler Market sign overhead, adding a vague tension that seemed to envelop everything around him. As his freshly polished leather shoes crossed the painted line on the road, hurried small footsteps echoed from the opposite corner, accompanied by the intermittent sobbing of a child. A skinny boy about 11 years old, with dirty clothes, was carrying his younger sister on his back, rushing out from a narrow alley as if fleeing something far worse than fear itself. The little girl, around 3, rested her head on his shoulder, her body drenched in sweat, cheeks flushed red, and tiny hands clutching the torn fabric of his shirt. Ben instinctively turned and stepped quickly toward the two children. The boy stumbled, running while looking back with wide, panicked eyes. Nearing the painted line, he nearly collided with Ven. The older man gently reached out and steadied his shoulder. "What's going on, son?" he asked in a low but firm voice. Ben stammered, breathing hard, looking at Ven like a lifeline in a storm. I went into the store to use the bathroom. They yelled, called the police. I was just carrying my sister. She's got a fever." Then bent down carefully, taking the little girl from Ben's arms. Her cheeks were burning hot, and her breathing was quick. He pressed the back of his hand lightly against her forehead, his eyes darkening. The girl murmured a few sounds before falling asleep on his shoulder like a wilted leaf. Behind them, a siren blared, shattering the remaining quiet of the street. The red flashing lights from a patrol car swept across Ven's back, shining directly on the road markings where he stood. The vehicle screeched to a halt just at the curb, its tires leaving a long, burnt mark on the asphalt. The atmosphere seemed to hold its breath. He then turned around, cradling the girl in his arms, still holding his hand protectively in front of Ben. Through the windshield, he saw the police officer inside, a cold, hard stare, clenched jaw, hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. It was a familiar look. No introduction needed, no words necessary. A gaze he had seen many times on battlefields, suspicion turned into raw authority, ready to fire if anyone moved out of line. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, lifting his chin slightly. His body stood firmly between the two children and the looming threat ahead. The bag of medicine slipped from his left hand to the ground, but he did not bend down to retrieve it. His eyes locked onto the figure behind the wheel, not with challenge, but as a silent warning. The car door flung open with a harsh creak. Heavy police boots hit the pavement, followed by the snap of a belt. The officer stepped out with measured, decisive strides. His hand did not raise a gun, but rested close to the holster, his eyes delivering a clearer command. He was accustomed to making arrests without question. Ben trembled, stepping back halfway before stopping at Ven's feet. "Sir," his voice barely above the sound of falling leaves, "please, don't let them take me." Ven said nothing. His gaze never left the officer approaching. Behind the wrinkles and scars of time lay a lifetime of survival, hundreds of negotiations with enemies, life and death decisions he had carried on his shoulders. But never before had he felt like this. This was his first confrontation where the threatened carried no weapons, demanded no power, and belonged to no clear side. It had no battle plan. It was simply a matter of right and wrong. The wind swept gently across the sidewalk. The smell of burning rubber and children's sweat mixed in the air. Standing on that fragile boundary where justice was threatened, Ven did not back down. He did not blink. He did not bow his head. His first battle in that town had just begun. No gunfire, no flags. Only a man standing against the wind, caught between flashing red lights and whispered pleas behind him. Officer Hahn stepped down from the driver's seat, his heel striking the pavement with a sharp sound amid the taut silence. He was tall, pale-skinned, broad-shouldered like a boxer, his right hand resting on his holster in a threatening habit. His eyes scanned Ven quickly before settling on Ben, the boy trembling in fear, clutching his still unconscious sister. "That boy fled the scene," Hans said, each word clipped as if reading from an indictment. "We were called due to suspicious behavior." Ben kept his tone calm, his eyes never leaving the officer's movements. "Suspicious behavior? What exactly?" he asked, expression unchanged. Hans did not answer. He pressed the shoulder radio button, sending a signal for backup. A distorted voice crackled from the speaker, briefly stating their location and priority code. Then he strode forward, as if everything had been predetermined. Ben bent slightly, resting a hand gently on Ben's shoulder, and whispered, "Why did you go in there?" Ben pressed his lips tightly, shaking his head vigorously. "I just needed to use the bathroom. My sister is sick," I asked. "But—" Ven nodded, eyes toward the convenience store at the end of the street. The glass reflected the flickering police lights like a pounding heartbeat. According to Ben, the manager had spotted the two children near the display counter and immediately showed irritation, calling security without asking a single question. Then, even though nothing was taken and the boy had done nothing wrong, they called the police, claiming they didn't look like customers. Han stopped 3 steps away, raising his voice. "Sit down. Hands behind your head." Ben froze, eyes glued to the sidewalk. The girl on his back started crying, her sobs sharp like broken glass cutting the air. Ven stepped forward halfway, voice low but resolute. "This boy is caring for his sick little sister. I was there. He took nothing. He threatens no one." Hands turned. His expression completely changed this time. "Who are you?" "Ven Washington," he replied. "I served 25 years in the United States military. Now, I'm a strategic advisor with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Hans raised an eyebrow, lips curling slightly as if hearing a bad joke. This is police business, Mr. Washington. No one needs a veteran meddling. Hans looked at him oddly, then pulled a leather wallet from his jacket pocket and produced 2 cards. One was a military ID, the other a federal ID, bearing his name with a faint, embossed seal. He held them out, palm open. I am witnessing an abuse of power, and I will report it. Hans did not look at the cards. Instead, he looked at Ven's eyes, slowly scanning him from head to toe as if appraising an object. Then he gave a soft, icy laugh without sound. Here, you are nothing. At that moment, Hans spoke into the radio an arrest order, citing resisting inspection, attempted escape. Ben was forced to kneel on the pavement, hands behind his head. The girl collapsed on his shoulder, crying hoarsely. Ben slid his hand into his inner jacket pocket, thumb activating video recording on his phone. The screen dimly showed the officer's face framed by flashing lights behind him. He did not need a clear shot, just to capture the truth. Cold wind whipped across the street, carrying the whispers of a few bystanders near a cafe across the road, hesitant to approach. In the flickering light reflecting off the dark pavement, Ven knew one thing for certain. This was not over, and if anyone thought he would stay silent, they had never seen how a soldier chooses to begin a counterattack. Ven took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Hans, his voice calm and resolute. He said, I ask you to stop restraining the boy. He is a minor, with no specific charges and no violent behavior. Hans glanced sideways, smirking with a look that dismissed Ven's very presence. Ven did not allow him to interrupt. According to civil rights laws, every citizen is protected against arbitrary searches and detentions. Police are not permitted to arrest based on subjective feelings or irrational judgment. Ponce frowned, letting go of his radio, his gaze darkening. You are obstructing an officer in the performance of his duties. No, Ven replied evenly, his voice sharp as a blade cutting paper. I am asking you to comply with the law. At that moment, Ben held his younger sister close, his face pale, eyes locked on the 2 adults, as if waiting for someone to touch a ticking bomb. Ven turned his head to look at the boy, gently placed a hand on his shoulder, then faced Hans again. He pulled his phone from his inner pocket, activated the camera facing Hans. The action was slow and deliberate, like when he used to disarm a safety lock before entering a combat zone. The screen clearly showed Hans's face under the red light of the police car, then raised his hand slightly and spoke loud enough for the whole street to hear. I am currently recording illegal coercive actions against 2 minors without evidence of guilt. This behavior violates civil rights and the duty to conduct proper investigations. A wave of whispers spread from across the street. Several people near the cafe took out their phones and hesitantly started recording. A young couple hurried across the street with their child but kept looking back. No one approached, but all eyes focused on one point. At the crosswalk stood a calm black man, confronting a weapon that didn't need to be drawn to instill fear. Hans stepped closer. The distance between them was now half an arm's length. His voice lowered, but did not soften. I don't care what black people did in Washington. This is Pinewood Grove. Here I am the law. Ven did not blink. His gaze held no anger or fear, only an unsettling calm, the kind of silence that makes the opponent feel as if they were speaking to a mirror. The law, he said slowly, is written to protect both the vulnerable and those in power. When an officer uses the law as a club instead of scales, that system loses its credibility. Congress must approve, and how? Congress. Very well. Hans squinted, as if trying to analyze what kind of enemy the man before him was. Ven did not back down, his hand still holding the phone steady. Behind him, the police car's spotlight continued to sweep the street like a hostile heartbeat. Amid the whistling wind and the recording device's hum, everything seemed poised on the edge of a cliff, one wrong breath away from falling. Ven tilted his head slightly back, his voice low but firm. "He stands behind me." Ben stepped back half a pace, pressing closer to him. In the flickering light and under watchful eyes, Ven knew he had just stepped into the gray zone of a war without bullets, where a single look could ignite violence, and silence could mark the start of a battle fiercer than any front line he had ever faced. Hans advanced without signal or reason. His hand snatched the phone from Ven with a rough precision that seemed rehearsed. The device fell to the pavement, smashing against the concrete curb with a sharp crack like breaking bones. The crowd watching held their breath, eyes wide, the atmosphere thickening as the sound shattered the silence. Ven instinctively turned his head, eyes tracking the shards falling near the gutter. Before he could react, Hans shoved him hard. Ven's body slammed into a lamppost behind, the collision echoing in the empty space. Hans's other hand rose quickly like a trained counterattack. His fist, hard as an iron hammer, struck Ven's forehead just above the left eyebrow. The blow jerked his head sideways, the pole trembled, and his whole body staggered like a soldier hit on the front line. Blood began to seep slowly, then poured rapidly, streaking down to the corner of his eye. Ven did not fall nor raise his hand to his head. He stood there, body slightly leaning, one foot sliding half a step, but his gaze never left the man who struck him. Hans looked at him as if waiting for a reaction, wanting to see anger or a scream, but there was no yell, no retaliatory blow, only a silence so cold it chilled the bones. A scream came from behind. Ben shouted loudly, pulling his sister back, his small body trembling as he shielded the bleeding man. The girl cried hysterically, tears and sobs cutting through the air like knives. Some bystanders near the shop steps stepped back. The man in the white suit had just been beaten in the street, and no one dared approach. Hans bent close to Ven, hissing through clenched teeth words he held until the end. "Don't think your medals and skin color make you better than me." He straightened, adjusted his police badge, flicked his hand over Ven's shoulder as if dusting off invisible dirt, then turned and walked back toward the patrol car. His gait was calm, unhurried, as if he had just completed a dull administrative task. Ven leaned against a lamppost, blood soaking through his shirt collar, spreading into a blurred red circle. He said nothing, did not wipe the blood, eyes following Hans's retreating figure, fading into the lights. There was no hatred in his eyes, only the cold emptiness of a man who once believed in discipline and honor, now betrayed by them in the heart of the city. A young woman near the kiosk hurriedly pulled out her phone, hands trembling. Her face was pale as she raised the device to record. A middle-aged man beside her bowed his head, whispering to himself, "They beat him. He did nothing." A second police car arrived, stopping at the end of the street. When an officer tried to get out, Hans waved his hand lightly, as if shooing flies. The other hesitated for a moment, then closed the door again. The wheels spun slowly, slipping away in programmed silence. Ben stepped forward, a tear-streaked face, eyes fixed on the blood dripping from Ven's forehead. He no longer cried or screamed. He just stood there, shielding his sister, small shoulders trembling with each breath. Ven slowly raised his hand, brushing over the wound, blood staining his fingertips. He stared at it for a long moment, then nodded very slightly, a nod that confirmed what had just happened was not a mistake or an isolated act. It was the beginning, and he had just entered a battle without commanders or maps, with only truth and blood as the sole constants. The ambulance sped through the quiet street, its siren fading as it entered the county hospital grounds. A medical staff member wheeled the stretcher into the emergency room, then the rest was a series of cold, routine procedures, taking blood pressure, wiping blood away, stitching the deep cut above the left eye with black thread. No one asked why a tall, middle-aged man, his shirt stained with blood, was brought in with such a severe wound right over his eye. They worked as if handling a minor traffic accident on a calm afternoon. Ven lay still, his eyes fixed on the white-painted ceiling, the occasional light casting shadows on his bruised cheekbone, making the swelling more pronounced. The hospital room was clean but old, with stained walls near the ventilation holes, thin curtains gently swaying to the rhythm of the air conditioner. No one entered, no police officer came to inquire, and no one recorded a report. A TV screen mounted on the wall played a news segment, minor scuffle between police and citizen. Police reportedly controlled the situation. A young doctor returned to the bedside, holding a clipboard, and asked in a polite tone, "Do you want to file a complaint or request an investigation?" Venn looked at him for a few seconds, then shook his head. His gaze drifted toward the window, where golden light filtered through the moving branches. Inside him, silence was no longer a surprise, but a test. The answer was not in this room, but outside, where everyone was choosing which side to stand on between truth and falsehood. Ben sat in the hallway, his legs dangling, feet barely touching the plastic chair. He held his younger sister tightly, his forehead resting against hers. She was still feverish, not fully conscious. Since arriving at the hospital, he had not left her side. Some nurses glanced at him passing by. One asked, "Where are the family?" He quietly replied, "My mother is coming." When their young mother hurried over, her clothes disheveled, eyes red from sleeplessness, she embraced the two children tightly and looked toward Venn, who leaned against the wall at the end of the corridor. She bent down, whispered thanks, then grasped her children's hands and quickly left, as if afraid someone would notice they had stayed too long. Venn sat up and took his backup phone from his personal bag. He opened the contact list and scrolled through the names of people who had worked with him in community security advisory programs. The first person did not answer. The second sent a message, "This is a local matter, I can't help." The third simply replied, "Sorry, that's too sensitive for the station." Leaning back in his chair, he replayed the video Ben had sent through the internal location app. The footage was blurry, shaky, and tilted, but it was still clear enough to see the officer striking a man standing motionless on the street. There was no sound, only flashing lights reflecting off the blood on the asphalt. A brief caption below the clip read, "I recorded it before they smashed your phone." Venn turned off the screen, brought his hand to his mouth, and lightly clenched his fist. This silence was not the kind he had faced on the battlefield, where enemies hid behind hot sand and red dust. This was selective silence, a collective choice not to touch what was uncomfortable. And this time that choice was not his. It belonged to every person scrolling through the news, reading vague headlines, then scrolling down to check the weather. Venn tried to understand the hospital ceiling blurred in Venn's eyes as he half-closed them. The dried blood at his temple throbbed faintly, like a ringing in the ears after a loud gunshot. This was a wound he was not allowed to bandage because it was not on his skin. Venn woke in the middle of the night, his back soaked, his hands gripping the corner of the old wooden bed until his knuckles turned white. His eyes opened wide. Ibu did not see the ceiling, only the glaring lights from a helicopter shining on the sand. In his dream, he was back on the Kandahar battlefield. The sharp sound of gunfire mixed with screams bounced from the radio. A young soldier to his left collapsed, his eyes still open, unable to utter his final command. But in an instant, the scene vanished. The sand and comrades faded, replaced by cold asphalt and the stinging sidewalk of Pinewood Grove. His blood spread under the police car lights, staining like a shame never before known in his military career. He sat up, fingers trembling slightly as he turned on the desk lamp. On the wooden surface lay a small notebook, a pen stuck at an angle, and a military ID placed beside a government advisor card. Each item was proof of 25 years of service at various ranks across many regions. On the day he was honored at the Pentagon, hundreds in uniform stood and saluted him. Every handshake was a silent promise that men like him, those who shielded others with their bodies, would always be respected. But lying on the ground, his hand being dragged, cheekbones swollen and bruised, no one recalled those promises. The local TV station, where he had once donated equipment for a community program, did not report the incident. The city hall, where he had once spoken about the spirit of service, remained silent. He held up his military ID and stared hard at the old photo. The face in the picture was neat, stern, eyes confident and disciplined. But in the eyes of the white officer that day, he was not a colonel who once advised hostage rescue strategies. He was a black man, appearing at the wrong time. The ID, once his badge of honor, had become invisible in the place he called home. The old battlefield had laws. There were enemies and friends, orders and boundaries. Here, he realized, he was fighting a nameless enemy wearing a badge, trained to maintain order, but taught to suppress resistance with force. That enemy did not hide in darkness. It appeared in broad daylight, acted before the public, and was still patted on the back and praised after the shift. The wound on his face would heal, but what weighed heavily on his heart was the look from the neighbor's boy, the son of an old comrade, when he saw Ven at the supermarket. The child who used to run after him, calling him Uncle Ven, Thuariario, Horio, now shrank back, pulling his mother's hand quickly down another aisle, as if his presence was linked to trouble, scandal, and a truth no one wanted to be involved in. The silence surrounding him was greater than any punch Hans had ever thrown. He reached for the notebook beside the bedside lamp. On the first blank page after the incident, he wrote a line. "The first day I was beaten was not because of my actions, but because of my existence." He stared at the words for a long time. It was no longer a personal note, but an undeniable admission. Once ideals are shattered by those wearing the colors of the state, silence is no longer neutrality. Silence is cooperation, and he did not return to cooperate with wrongdoing. The pen remained in his hand. But the next page would contain more than a single line. There would be plans, strategies, contacts, and counterattacks, because from tonight he knew the new battlefield was where he stood. The afternoon stretched through the foggy glass window of the county hospital, the pale golden sunlight sweeping across the worn tiled floor. Ven sat quietly on the chair beside the bed, his head wrapped in white bandages, eyes lost in silence between two deep breaths. The sound of heels clicked lightly but firmly. A woman appeared at the door, holding a thin document bag, a worn leather-covered old recorder hanging from her shoulder. She wore no suit, carried no press badge. Ven looked up, his eyes slightly narrowed. He had never met her before, yet the way she looked at him felt strangely familiar. "My name is Maya," she said, pulling up a chair and sitting opposite him. "And I'm not here out of curiosity." Her voice was calm and steady, without a single question. She placed the bag down and pulled out some recycled paper files, a few faded screenshots, and scanned copies of traffic stop reports showing signs of tampering. Then glanced briefly, flipping a page. The victims' names were all familiar: young people, people of color, stopped without cause in the town. "I used to work for a newsroom in Richmond," Maya said, placing her hand on the recorder, "until I investigated a case where police accidentally shot a 14-year-old boy holding a soda bottle. The editorial board chose silence. I chose to leave." She told her story as if reading from a forgotten file herself. After losing her job, she moved to Pinewood Grove. Initially, she intended to stay only a few months, but the numbers and traces kept appearing. Her blog account was locked 3 times, her car vandalized twice, and once she was nearly pushed down the apartment stairs. Yet she kept writing, kept investigating. She did not wait for anyone's permission to speak out about what everyone feared to face. "This file," Maya pointed to the stack on the table, "is only a small part. It can't be aired on television, but it is real." Ven put the documents down and looked straight at her. In that gaze there was no doubt, only assessment, an old instinct of someone who had to read others in seconds to survive. Her eyes did not waver or tremble, yet deep within them was a faint, silent, steel-sharp gleam. The light of someone once abandoned, pushed out of safety, who still stood for one thing only: the truth. "They beat you because you are the kind of man who, if he wakes up, will not swallow silence like a painkiller," was her first sentence after placing the recorder on the table, a firm statement. Ven leaned back, his shoulders slightly falling. He had yet to decide whether to speak out, but what he saw in her hands was no accident. This was not a misstep, it was a thin ice layer over a pond already cracked long ago. Maya took out an old craft paper sheet and spread it on the table. It was a hand-drawn map of the town, marked in red pen with spots where police often set up checkpoints. mostly around the black residential neighborhoods. Next to it were several addresses, victims who had been beaten and threatened, but no one dared testify. "We don't have time to wait for courtesy," Maya said, her voice low but as hard as stone. "They will cover what's been revealed, erase traces, suffocate responses. If you truly want to fight, we must start tonight." She folded the map and pushed it toward him. Under the pale yellow light spilling onto the hospital table, no one spoke further, yet Ven's slight nod was enough for a front line to begin to take shape. The cafe hid on a small street beside the hospital, its dim yellow light casting shadows over the rough brick walls. The gentle clinking of a spoon against a ceramic cup was as quiet as the conversation unfolding in the deepest corner. Vin sat back, his eyes gazing through the misted glass. Across the street, a gas station stood dark, its sign flickering faintly. Maya opened her laptop, turning the screen toward him, displaying blurred but clear enough images. Houses around the black neighborhoods were all marked, purchased under a subsidiary company's name of a large real estate corporation based in the neighboring state. "This is how they do it," Maya said, pointing to the map on the table, red dots surrounding like drops of blood. "Buy cheap pressure evictions with the police, then convert into clean commercial projects. Law here is just a shadow of money." Ven quietly flipped through the documents, each page filled with distorted notes, photos of houses damaged under system checks, hastily signed administrative summons without clear response deadlines. Amid those dry lines were traces of a town being stripped layer by layer, community roots torn out. Maya pulled out a thin envelope from her bag. Inside was a photo of a man around 50, his gaze firm, chin square, dressed in uniform. "He served alongside you at Fort Hood, moved back to Pinewood Grove to live with his family, opened a bike shop. 3 months ago, he was beaten and suffered broken ribs for intervening in a wrongful arrest. His case file disappeared from the system 3 days later." Ven stared long at the photo. His hand rested on it, fingers trembling slightly. War had never made him falter, but seeing a comrade beaten down in his own neighborhood drained the faith he had guarded his whole life. "I know you want to keep silent," Maya said softly, her voice sharp like a blade cutting through the outer layer of restraint. "But silence protects no one. It only prolongs fear." He did not answer immediately. Outside the window, darkness had fallen. The breeze gently shook the gray curtains. Ven took a deep breath, sat upright, and looked at Maya. "They don't know I still keep in contact with some people in the Veterans Council," he said slowly. "I can request an independent investigation. It won't be fast, but enough to overturn some things." Maya nodded. "I will keep meeting witnesses. Some are ready to speak out, but they need to know they are not alone." Neither shook hands nor recorded minutes. Their eyes met long enough to understand what was agreed, without words. Maya closed the laptop, gathered the map and papers and stuffed them into her bag. Ven took an old handkerchief to wipe his glasses and stood up. "I once led on the battlefield," he whispered, as if to himself. "Now I'm ready to be the last soldier at home." The cafe door opened and night air flowed in, cold and damp. Across the street, a black SUV idled beside a lamppost. Its headlights flashed briefly like a signal. Maya saw it, and so did Ven. Neither spoke. They stepped out, walking straight into the darkness, as if each step had been rehearsed beforehand. The first step always shakes the ground. And they just took it. Derek sat quietly in the car as his shift ended, the streetlights casting faint patterns through the dusty windshield, drawing invisible lines between him and the rest of the world. Beside him lay a badge, worn thin at the edges, a trace of the years when he once believed that maintaining order was his life's purpose. He had joined the force when he was young, carrying with him the image of his father, a model police officer, strict, firm, and always repeating, "The law is meant to protect those who obey." Derek had thought that was true, but reality was far from the stories his father told. From the very first weeks at Pinewood Grove, he began to witness the gap between theory and practice. The case where Ben was chased like a criminal simply because of a mistaken call from a store manager left him unsettled. Yet he remained on the sidelines. Everything changed when he saw Hans assault a black man in the street, later learning the man was Ven Washington. It wasn't the blow itself that shook him, but how everyone else looked away and the next day still smiled and chatted in the meeting room as if nothing had happened. From that day, Derek started documenting everything. He wasn't sure what he would do with the records, only that he could no longer keep his eyes closed. Each report was backed up and every vague order was noted. He pasted these notes inside his locker and locked it carefully every time he went on patrol. Then, one night, hearing Maya say on an independent podcast, "Silence from within is the highest wall the truth must climb," Derek decided to act. He sent the first batch of documents through an encrypted mailbox. They included internal reports, unusual shift schedules, and handwritten instructions from superiors urging a quick resolution if the subject shows resistance. Maya replied 2 days later. The first sentence she wrote was, "I know you're in the force. The way you describe the shift structure couldn't be faked." She suggested a meeting, but Derek declined. He knew that one slip, one reveal of his identity, and everything would be over. After each information drop, he began to sense changes. One morning, his desk was rearranged. Items out of place, though he clearly remembered where they had been. His shift schedule was repeatedly changed at the last minute without explanation. His phone emitted strange clicks when he called out. His police instincts told him someone was watching, but the strangest feeling wasn't there. Longer than usual stares, silence when he entered the break room, offhand remarks like, "The snitch is always the calmest one." Once, an old patrol colleague whispered close to his ear, "Don't get involved in things that aren't yours." That wasn't a threat, but a plea, a warning. At home, Derek was hardly himself anymore. He avoided gatherings and cut off old colleagues. His partner began asking more questions, but he just smiled it off, blaming work pressure. The more he hid, the more he felt choked from inside. Though no one accused him outright, it felt as if the whole unit knew he was walking a line, just waiting for the wind to blow him off balance. Eventually, during a special internal meeting, the commander announced signs of sensitive document leaks. His voice wasn't loud, but each word rang like a gunshot. The room fell silent. A minute stretched endlessly before he added, "We will find whoever is responsible, and when we do, there will be no negotiation." Derek sat still, hands clenched under the table, knuckles white. His eyes met no one, but inside he knew well the line he stood on was about to collapse. Beyond it lay only one way, a choice. The streets were still wet from last night's rain. Dawn had yet to fully break, but police lights already flashed in the intersection. Derek stood at the curb, eyes fixed on the thin figure of a black youth pressed face down against the car hood. The license plate had a single misprinted digit, but to Hans that was a valid reason to conduct a suspicious behavior check. The youth did not resist. He said only one sentence, "I'm on my way to an early shift." Yet within 3 minutes, Hans's hand pressed hard on his neck, head slammed into the cold metal. Another officer yanked open the car door for a search. Third pulled out a stun baton. Derek stood 4 steps away, silent. He neither signaled nor intervened. When it was over, the young man was handcuffed, his left cheek bruised, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. He was shoved into the car like an anonymous package. Back at the station, laughter echoed in the break room. Hans bragged, "If he'd struggled a bit more, I would have snapped his neck. Kids like that only learn when their heads hit the metal." Some laughed along, others remained silent. Derek said nothing. He stepped outside, went straight to the restroom, locked the door, and retched until his eyes turned red. The memory of that youth's gaze haunted him all day. Not a look of fear, but one without surprise, as if he had known it would happen, as if he had been through it before and knew it would happen again, no matter if he screamed or not. That night, for the first time in weeks of avoidance, Derek contacted Maya and arranged to meet at a quiet park. Meeting under the dim streetlights, he neither shook her hand nor introduced himself. He just opened his bag and pulled out a carefully plastic-wrapped stack of files. Maya read the clear print. List of officers transferred to civilian control training. Project M99. Civic Restoration League. Nothing needed explaining. Each name was a memory. Some had quit. Some were still patrolling every day. She looked up, eyes full of emotion but voice steady. "Thank you for not being silent like the others." Derek nodded slightly. He did not explain why he did it, but they both knew. The line had been crossed. Beyond it, there was no turning back. 3 days later, he was summoned to the Internal Affairs office. No specific accusations, just a routine check on security and procedure compliance. Everything in the room was by the book, official, but no one looked at him as a colleague anymore. Back home, Derek sat at his computer writing a resignation letter. He did not send it, not yet, but for the first time in his life, he did not feel regret. He had once believed the police were the solution, but now he knew when a system is designed to make people bow their heads, staying inside is a form of complicity. Late at night, he opened his notebook and wrote a short line. "I once believed I was part of the solution, but I realized I was part of the problem." The streetlight shone through the window pane, reflecting on the police badge recently removed from his uniform. It lay quietly on the desk, no longer symbolizing anything. The box of documents arrived in Maya's hands on a drizzly afternoon. The sender was Thomas Granger, a veteran who had served under Venn Washington and now worked at the National Military Archives. There was no message except for a typed, italicized note on the outside, "Withdrawn from the system by direct order, do not distribute." This could only mean one of two things. Either it was too dangerous to disclose or too shameful to keep. Maya opened the box. The thin sheets of paper still carried the damp smell of the storage room. She carefully flipped through each page, determined not to miss a single word. Right from the first few pages, a place name made her pause. The southern suburbs of Pinewood Grove, where, 15 years earlier, hundreds of black households had been forcibly cleared. At the time, the official reason given was emergency planning to build a military training support zone. The press reported for a few days, then fell silent. No one was held accountable. No one got their homes back. Within this file, the truth was far clearer. It revealed a coordinated plan between local government and the Department of Defense, codenamed Special Urban Security Operation. Officially, it aimed to ensure safety after widespread riots, but vague phrases like handling high-risk hotspots, controlled coercive response, and clearing potential disruptive residential structures sent chills down Maya's spine. This was not a protection plan. It was a strategy of social manipulation disguised as security. She turned to the appendix. A list of strategic advisory members appeared. Under the printed letters, Maya recognized a familiar name, Colonel Venn Washington. She frowned. Next to his name was a handwritten risk assessment in bold blue ink. Harsh measures are necessary to maintain order, even if short-term damage occurs. Signed, VWW. Maya froze. Not because she doubted Venn's character, but because she never imagined he could be part of such a decision. She reread the note 3 times before placing her hand on the document's edge, overwhelmed by a strange feeling. Disappointment? Suspicion? Or simply the fear of seeing darkness within someone she trusted. She spent nearly 2 hours weighing whether to give the documents to Venn. Part of her wanted to hold on until the right moment, yet another part reminded her that silence was complicity. If they were fighting to expose the system, they could not afford to do what that system once did, hide the truth. When Venn took the file, he asked no questions and showed no surprise. He only nodded when Maya said, "I think you need to know this." He sat down, opened the file, his hand trembling slightly at the paper's edge. Minutes passed in silence. Venn's face changed little, but as he turned the pages, his gaze grew heavier. Upon reaching the last page, where his own handwritten comment from years ago lay, his hand stopped, holding still for a long moment. "I once believed in its necessity," he whispered, not looking at Maya. His voice neither defended nor expressed regret. It was a bare, unadorned admission. In the small room, only the sound of rain falling outside and a silence heavy as stone remained. A new chapter had opened, not to accuse, but to begin the harshest dialogue between a man and the past he once believed was right. After receiving the file from Maya that evening, Venn did not return to the office. He went straight home, quietly, as if carrying the entire battlefield in his mind. The old wooden house at the end of the dirt road where he had grown up was now the refuge he sought when outside voices had become superfluous. Ven neither turned on the lights nor ate dinner. He sat on the porch all night, hands gripping the wooden railing tightly, eyes fixed southward toward the neighborhood once home to black families, cleared to maintain order. Old memories surged like a flood. Afghanistan, Kandahar, dusty border roads, sudden ambushes, bullets piercing the night. That was where he once believed force was the tool of peace. On the battlefield, Vin never questioned. He trusted the reason America sent him there, believing that keeping a land quiet through discipline was a mission beyond justification. Yet now, what was once called a domestic security strategy bore the same logic applied to his own people. There were no live bullets, but there were riot police, coercive orders, lockdowns, and the tacit silence among those in uniform. That night, his mother woke feeling cold. She slowly stepped onto the porch, carrying a thin blanket, finding her son staring blankly into the darkness. Without asking anything specific, she simply sat beside him and softly said, "Is there something keeping you awake?" Ven said nothing. That question needed no answer. It was an acknowledgement that she had seen the weight on him, as any mother could feel from her child. The next morning, he met Maya again. Her eyes no longer held suspicion, but a silent respect. Contrary to her fears, Ven was not angry. He said, "Thank you for showing me. If I still thought I was right, then I would be like them." That sentence was not a justification, but the conclusion of a man who dared to face the darkness he once stood in without turning away. That afternoon, Ven took a pen and wrote a letter. The recipient was Charles Dempsey, a name appearing in a small appendix noted as the person who obstructed the relocation order. He was unsure if Charles was still alive or even if the letter would reach him. Yet he wrote a simple apology without promises or retractions, just words from someone who once contributed to the tragedy. After finishing, he folded the letter and returned to his desk. Next to the rank insignia he had removed on a heavy night, he placed the stack of old files, two opposing symbols, one of the glory he was once honored for, the other proof of the blindness he had helped build. The afternoon breeze blew through the window, flipping the first page signed by him 15 years ago. Ven stared at it, then quietly whispered, to no one in particular, "Silence, when one has the power to choose, is also a form of complicity." For the first time, he did not turn away when saying that, and for the first time he felt he was standing on the right side. No longer a commander, no longer a symbol, just a man learning to take responsibility. The article appeared on Monday morning. The large headline on the front page of the Pinewood Daily Chronicle seemed to choke the entire town. "Former military man incites police at civilian checkpoint." Just below was a video lasting less than 30 seconds, cut from multiple angles with blurry quality and compressed audio. In the clip, Ven approaches the officer holding Ben, his face tense, hand raised as if signaling. There was no footage of Hans pushing Ben or assaulting Ven afterward. The article offered no clear conclusion but was filled with insinuations. The reporter emphasized, although a figure with past contributions, Mr. Washington seemed to have lost emotional control, accompanied by commentary from a former police officer. It is dangerous when those trained for combat get involved in civilian situations without restraint. The media did not merely report, they constructed a narrative. Local radio stations invited community ethics experts to analyze and collectively pushed the argument that Ven was exploiting his military image to manipulate public opinion, suggesting this could be an attempt to destabilize the community following the police budget reform. Every word and analysis avoided mentioning Hans's violent actions. No one spoke of Ben. Maya noticed something unusual about the speed of the information spreading. Less than 6 hours after the incident, the article was present on all local news platforms. A close source revealed the article bypassed the usual internal censorship process and was directly pushed from above for immediate release. Simultaneously, the police department's communications office held a brief press conference stating the case was under internal review, while refusing to provide details, citing community security. Ben did not react immediately. He was silent, reading the article repeatedly with an unchanged expression. Others, however, were not so calm. His already frail mother received threatening calls late at night. Ben was asked to take a temporary leave from school until the situation stabilizes. At the supermarket, someone sneered that he was causing trouble for attention. A white woman quietly pulled her child closer as he passed by. Even Maya received anonymous messages. A forged audio clip was circulated, her voice altered and edited to appear as though inciting an attack on the system. Public opinion is split. Half trusted the media, while the rest remained silent, uncertain of what was truly happening. Within days, they not only lost control of the story, but they were pushed into suspicion. That evening, Maya sat opposite Van in the living room, the yellow light softly illuminating the stained wall. She spoke firmly. "If we let them build your image first, all our efforts will start at a deficit." Van looked out the window. The streetlight reflected coldly in his glasses. He said slowly, "Then it's time to take back the story." Comments began to spread like wildfire. On X, Threads, Facebook, and community forums, hashtags bearing Ven's name appeared repeatedly with two opposing tones. Half the users mocked the incident, ridiculing him as a delusional old man, a veteran living in a fantasy of power, or worse, a troublemaker disguised in an old uniform. A reaction video from a popular streamer mocked Ven Washington, military general scared of a license plate check. Thousands liked and responded gleefully in the comments. On the other side, the other half of social media voices were angry. They not only rejected mainstream media, but also offered image analyses, frame-by-frame comparisons to prove video manipulation. "Where is the push?" a user commented, pointing to a blank frame in the official report. A group of media students created a blog to compile all video versions, comparing every detail. Amid the anger, one question echoed through every debate. If the system were fair, why would they need to edit the clip? Maya remained silent. In the dark of this public attack, she spent 2 days tracing the source of the images. An anonymous encrypted message led her to a phone-recorded clip, raw, shaky, but complete. From a hidden corner across the street, the video showed Ben being pulled out of a store, thrown onto the curb, and Ven rushing over, raising his hand to stop it. Then came a violent strike from Hans, blood splattering on the pavement, bystanders shouting, all with sound. Maya merged this clip with footage from the store's security camera. The original audio had been erased. She processed each frame, adjusted brightness and volume, and reconstructed a seamless version. No cuts, no commentary, just images and the sound of truth. She did not send it to television stations. Instead, she uploaded it to an international platform specializing in human rights and decentralized data. The title read, "Unedited Version." The description, "When the storyteller is silenced, let the camera speak." The video went viral. Within half a day, it appeared on the home pages of organizations like Truthwatch and The Global Lens. An independent journalist reshared it with the caption, "When justice is censored, silence becomes a crime." On social media, the hashtag #UncutVen video appeared everywhere, from university lectures to student posters posted outside police headquarters. However, the reaction was not purely supportive. Conservative channels pushed back. A state legislator called for careful verification of the tape's authenticity and questioned the possibility of AI technology being used to fake it. Extremist accounts circulated images of Maya's face photoshopped onto sensitive scenes, accusing her of being a disguised foreign agent. Yet the media storm had already spun beyond their control. That evening, Ven sat in the living room with his laptop on the table, playing the original video. He looked at the frame where he lay face down on the pavement, blood soaking through his sleeve, not resisting, no defense. The screen's light reflected on his face, silent but steady. Maya sat opposite, saying nothing. He nodded slowly. "They can distort the sound, but they cannot distort what the eyes have witnessed." He looked at the camera Maya had prepared. For the first time, Ven agreed to speak out, not for fame, but for those who never had the chance. Clarice Monroe entered the meeting room with the resolute demeanor of someone who had faced the system many times and never backed down. Ven stood up and shook her hand, his eyes filled with a mix of respect and a tense seriousness that was hard to hide. They said little, opening a laptop and starting to review the video of Hans beating him that day. Clarice watched from beginning to end, her face almost expressionless, occasionally taking notes. When the clip ended, she nodded slightly. "We have grounds." Ven shared everything he knew, from Hans's unusual behavior to the murky connections between the local police and businesses. Maya added audio files, anonymous letters, and internal reports that Derek had risked smuggling out. Clarice carefully examined each piece of evidence, methodical like a doctor reading scans of a complex case. "We will file a lawsuit under Section 1983, violation of civil rights under color of law. But I won't stop at Hans. If the system covers for him, we will bring the entire town council and the State Department of Justice into this." Clarice spoke decisively, her eyes leaving no room for half measures. Preparing the case was a race against risk. Clarice demanded that all documents be encrypted and backed up on 3 different platforms. Derek helped verify the recording timestamps. Maya tracked down additional witnesses at the scene, including a supermarket employee who had quietly recorded with a phone. They all understood the longer they waited, the easier it was to be ambushed. 3 days later, Clarice officially filed the case with the federal court. The dossier was thick, signed by the victim, the legal representatives, and 3 key witnesses. The lawsuit could trigger a federal investigation, something Clarice believed was the only way to expose the whole system. The news had not leaked outside, but the Pinewood Grove internal circles were shaken. The town prosecutor's office pushed back in an internal memo, calling this a politicization of law enforcement, while summoning their legal team to prepare a response. Clarice warned Ven, "Once this filing gets out, they will play dirty, from the media to your personal safety. Are you sure you're ready?" Ven looked at her, his voice hoarse. "I've stood before the Taliban. I won't back down before a town council." On his way home, Ven passed the police headquarters. The yellow light spilling from inside cast a dull glow. Someone stood in the shadows, but he didn't stop. The badge Hans wore that day remained in his memory like an unhealed scar. Now he was no longer alone. Ahead lay the legal battle he had chosen, not for personal honor, but for children like Ben who deserved to grow up without fear. A silver SUV parked 3 houses away from Maya's, engine off but windows glowing faintly with blue light. For 3 consecutive nights, it appeared in the evening and vanished near dawn. Maya first became suspicious when she saw it reverse as she stepped out, but it wasn't until the 4th night that she was sure it wasn't a coincidence. The front door lock showed slight scratches. Nothing was missing. Everything inside remained in place, yet her laptop keyboard bore a strange fingerprint. When she turned it on, the encryption software automatically disconnected and warned of unauthorized access from an internal device. The clear sign was a message: "We are inside." At the police station, Derek quietly opened his personal drawer. Inside lay a brown envelope without a postal stamp. He opened it to find a blurry printed photo of himself talking to Maya at the park the day before. The angle was distant but clear enough to see both their faces. Attached was a scrawled note: "Silence means survival." No signature, no identification, just a bare warning. Maya immediately rechecked her entire communication system. She replaced all equipment, switched to a private encrypted connection, and moved temporarily to a friend's house inside a gated community. She also notified Clarice, requesting to suspend all unknown calls. Derek stayed quieter. He told no one in his family but carefully backed up all investigation data, sending it to an encrypted storage address in another state. It was the first time he sent anything out without reporting to superiors. Ben arrived at Clarice's office late afternoon to find the main door ajar. There was no obvious sign of forced entry, but inside, 3 hard drives lay scattered on the desk, their casings pried open. Clarice stood calmly in the corner, unusually composed, saying, "I guess today they wanted to see what we're hiding." Fortunately, she had sent copies of the main files to a security partner 2 days earlier. From that moment on, Clarice decided not to use a fixed office anymore. All meetings were moved to cafes, libraries, or parks, places crowded and under city surveillance cameras. With training home, Venn ran his fingers along the letters of the nameplate at his door before removing it. The feeling of being watched was no longer just a hunch. Every move seemed to be in the sight of a system that knew exactly how to dismantle from within. No one could be sure which cameras were intact, who was still trustworthy. This fight had gone beyond him personally. It was a clash between those who believed in civic responsibility and a network playing by its own rules. As night fell, Maya received a strange message from an unknown number not saved in her contacts. The content was brief. "Don't think justice is when you survive. Justice is when we stay silent but still win." She stared at the screen, then powered off the phone, removed the battery and put it away in a drawer. Looking in the mirror, she clearly saw how exhausted she was. But what made her sigh was not fear. It was the stark realization that if hesitation persisted, someone would be silent. And next time, it might no longer be a warning. Under the early morning light, Pinewood Grove was no longer as peaceful as usual. People were gathering along the roads leading to the police headquarters. At first, there were a few elderly individuals, then small groups from the southern neighborhoods arrived, carrying banners, images of Ben holding his little sister, and clips taken from dash cameras. Familiar faces, neighbors, Venn's former colleagues, acquaintances from the church, gradually lined the sidewalks. Among the crowd were teachers, veterans, and university students from the neighboring town. A handheld loudspeaker sounded, not to incite rebellion, but to remind everyone to remain calm. Tasha Monroe, a white high school teacher, stepped onto the old tiled steps in front of the town hall. Her voice was not loud, but every word was clear. "We teach students right from wrong. Today, it is we who must be that lesson." Applause echoed, reaching the police barricades surrounding the headquarters. A group of officers stood silently on guard, dressed in riot gear. When Venn appeared at the end of the street, the crowd seemed to part to let him through. He wore no uniform and carried no badge, only an old coat, his head held high. He walked straight to the barricade without shouting or showing anger, raising his hand in a gesture for silence. His voice was deep, ringing like a command from old battlefields. "We come to ask questions, not to destroy." Maya walked beside him, clutching a file tightly. An old soldier in the crowd stood at attention, saluting, a gesture that spread through the area like a quiet wave, bringing respect instead of chance. Behind the barricade, Chief Linden watched everything through internal cameras. Venn's arrival made him change plans. He ordered a reduction in the defense level and invited Venn for a private negotiation. One person, no more than 2. Venn did not hesitate. He looked at Maya and nodded gently. The two crossed the barricade in complete silence. No one shouted, no one pulled out phones to record. Only an elderly woman with silver hair knelt before the station gate, placing a bouquet of white flowers on the ground. A handwritten ribbon wrapped around the bouquet read, "Ben could be my grandson." Amid the wind and heavy breaths, it felt as if all of Pinewood Grove was holding its breath, waiting to see whether justice this time would speak from within or continue to be buried. Inside the old meeting room of Pinewood Grove Police Station, the pale yellow light could not conceal the suffocating tension. Chief Grover sat opposite Venn, once a military advisor, now a symbol of resistance. Grover entered with 2 deputies, his face trying to stay calm, but his hands slightly trembling as he held a glass of water. Venn spoke in an even, polite tone. He reiterated the reason for his presence, not to provoke, but to seek answers. Yet every question he posed was a cut into Grover's silent facade. Why were the reports about Hans never dealt with? Why were community complaints ignored? And why had unlawful arrests increased during the same period that Hans received promotions? Grover responded slowly. We follow procedures. Every complaint must go through 3 stages of internal investigation. Ven neither shrugged nor raised his eyebrows. He quietly played an audio recording Maya had prepared. Hans's voice, accompanied by an anonymous superior's reminder. Someone who bluntly said, "There is protection from above. Just be tough." Grover fell silent for a few seconds. He set down his glass, glanced furtively at his deputies, then replied, "I am not aware of all the details. I did not sign those orders." Ven looked him straight in the eye. "And because you did not sign, you think you are innocent?" Without raising his voice, he made the whole room fall silent. "Your procedures are killing the people." At that moment, a young officer knocked and entered, handing Maya a sheet of paper. It was a list of those requesting transfers or temporary suspension. Maya glanced quickly and leaned over to whisper, "They are beginning to choose sides." Grover lowered his head for a moment, as if realizing the unified facade had cracked. Meanwhile, Hans was held in the isolation room. He said nothing, but his face was blank, no longer showing the usual arrogant look. Grover had not ordered an official arrest yet, citing the need to maintain internal stability, but fear was already evident. Ven wasted no time. He presented 3 demands: an independent investigation by an external agency, lifting surveillance orders on Ben, and a public apology to the community for past misconduct. Grover bit his lip and asked for 24 hours to work with the state authorities. Ven agreed, but did not withdraw his warning. "I am not here to give an ultimatum. I am here to remind you, if conscience still exists, this is the last moment for it to speak." As the 2 left the room, Maya stepped past a window looking out. The crowd remained still, no cheers, no chaos. No one knew exactly what had happened inside, but all were silent. Ven passed through the main door without another word. A boy about 16 held high a hand-drawn sign, "If you fail, we will carry on." The late sunlight shone on the dust on the stone steps. Before the police station, the silence of hundreds rang out like a declaration that justice was no longer a favor, but a promise, a vow to uphold at all costs. Ben Washington placed his suitcase neatly by his feet, his eyes scanning the small bus station at the edge of town. The dark suit he wore was pressed sharply to every fold. The cuffs still marked faintly from the military uniform he had just taken off before stepping down from the vehicle. A gentle breeze rustled through the roadside trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and an old air that he thought he had left behind many years ago. A rusty sign, "Pinewood Grove, where every memory begins," hung wavering on the station's awning, swaying gently with the passage of time. No one recognized the middle-aged man who once commanded thousands of soldiers at forward bases in Afghanistan. No one knew he had sat in the Pentagon's conference room, presenting strategic plans to counter cross-border threats, and received a medal personally from the Secretary of Defense last autumn. That moment remained etched in his memory like a brief, straightforward film. No extravagance, just a firm handshake, appropriate praise, and the steady applause of uniformed personnel below the auditorium. Yet now, he'd return not for honor but for one person alone, his mother. The old station, the red dirt road leading to the residential area, and the unfamiliar looks he received when entering the first convenience store all felt like a discordant tune. The shop was closing early. The elderly owner kept her distance, glancing at him when he asked to buy a bottle of water and some cold medicine. "We don't accept cash after 9, she said, even though the clock behind her showed only 8. Ben did not argue. He nodded, took his wallet, and stepped outside. On the narrow sidewalk, a young man in sportswear brushed hard against him as he passed. Ven's shoulder was pushed askew, and his arm instinctively tightened slightly. The youth did not stop or apologize, only smirked faintly. Ven stood still, turned around, then let it be. His eyes, which had once witnessed blood and fire, were now as cold as still water. A police car was parked across the street. Inside sat a young officer, straight-backed, with hands on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on Ven. No expression, no greeting. That look spoke volumes without words. Ven turned away, gripping his bag's handle tightly. A familiar feeling surged. not from the battlefield but from youthful days, when he had been questioned for standing outside a white friend's house, asked to leave a bookstore because he didn't look like someone who could buy anything there. He turned onto a small T-junction, a road leading south of town where his mother's old house still nestled between two abandoned yards. The wind blew through his collar, the scent of wild grass and thyme hitting his nose. Pinewood Grove no longer smelled of baked goods and dry straw like before. Now it was heavy, silent, a moment suspended between stillness and vigilance. Ven slowed as he neared the street's end. There was something in his step, not exactly fatigue, but a sharp pang felt when returning to a place where one no longer belonged. He raised his head, shoulders still straight, chin slightly lifted, yet his eyes gradually quieted. Pinewood Grove had changed, and he knew he hadn't just come back to care for his aging mother. Another front awaited him, right in the place called home. The wooden house at the road's end, shaded by an oak tree, remained as weathered as in Ven's memory. The faded metal roof, the creaking wooden steps beneath each footfall, and the crooked sign, "God bless this home," hanging askew on the porch. Its letters worn by time, but still there, like a stubborn prayer clinging to a world-changing colors. Yellow light spilled from a small window, making the house appear as a fragile beacon amid the gloomy town. Mrs. Lucille sat in an old rocking chair, hands clasped on her lap. When the door opened, her eyes brightened. She looked thinner than the last time Ven had seen her, her face deeply lined with time's folds, but her smile remained whole. Ven bent down to embrace his mother. She squeezed his hand gently, her breath short, but her gaze proud. "My son has returned?" she whispered. Ven answered with a small smile. Neither needed many words. The 15 years of absence filled that moment. Dinner was simple. Cornbread and bean soup. Under warm yellow light, Ven spoke about his days working in Washington, while Mrs. Lucille nodded occasionally, interjecting a few questions before quietly observing her son. As the meal neared its end, she half-joked, half-stated, "They don't see you as a hero here anymore, Ven." Ven took a sip of water, setting the glass down slowly. "I didn't come back to be called that." She smiled faintly, eyes scanning the kitchen window. "People only see skin color now. Kids here get pushed down on the sidewalks, then asked for papers. Passing the center wearing a hoodie means being watched. The kids have to go everywhere in pairs these days. Alone means trouble." Ven fell silent. From where he sat, he could clearly see the street through the kitchen glass. A group of police officers was searching an old car. There was no accident, no collision. A young black man stood with his hands on his head, eyes lowered to the ground. The scene reminded Ven of civil control, tactical training long ago, only her, and there was no reason, no explanation, just silence and control. The grocery store at the street's start, where he once bought his first peppermint candy, had now been replaced by a brightly lit convenience store with LED lights. Mr. Lewis, with his gentle smile, was gone, replaced by anti-theft warnings plastered thick across the glass. Cameras were mounted in all four corners, casting a chilling atmosphere inside and out. The town kept its old name, but its soul had vanished long ago. After dinner, Ven stepped into the living room. The altar for his father sat in the right corner, beside an old wedding photo. He placed his hand on the wooden frame, gently brushing away a thin layer of dust. The picture showed a man in a white shirt, his calm face carrying a quiet pride in his eyes. Years ago, his father had said, "Keep going, son. You must return not to live, but to set an example." Back then, Ven had not fully understood. Now, in this cold town, he began to grasp every word. The wind chime outside the porch suddenly rang, its gentle tinkling like a reminder. Ven turned his head and straightened up. He wore no rank, had no unit, and no weapon, yet his heart was not empty. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow I will start again. From here." Under the gloomy sky of Pinewood Grove, a new light cut through the silence. That morning, Maya stood in a small room nestled within the old residential area in the southern part of town, accompanied by a group of lawyers and 2 independent journalists. On the table lay a dossier that she and Derek had spent months collecting and verifying, secured by 3 layers of encryption. The truth was waiting to be awakened. Derek was absent from the announcement. but had sent a complete copy of the documents to a state legislator, one who had previously spoken out against police abuses in an earlier case. This time, Maya was not just handing over evidence to the press. She chose to live stream on social media, providing a public link to the archived documents. Her opening words were brief. "Those who thought they were invisible will today be seen by the whole world." The documents exposed the entire scheme of land manipulation through forced evictions in predominantly black neighborhoods. In one recording, Hans, then sitting with a representative from the Civic Restoration League, discussed in detail the creation of disturbance situations as a pretext for deploying forces to enforce evictions. Accompanying this was a list of officers who received benefits from the relocation fund, including off-the-books bonuses and discounted home purchase vouchers within the lands to be transferred. A clear money flow chart was presented. From an anonymous real estate company, funds were funneled through a charity organization, then moved into state officials' accounts under the label Local Assistance Expenses. The trail was unmistakable, figures exact and dates aligned with eviction events. News spread faster than anticipated. Media outlets that had previously ignored the case began to engage. Major television networks dispatched reporters to Pinewood Grove. Old footage of evictions was replayed alongside the released files, sparking public outrage. That very evening, townspeople gathered in the central square. Maya and her team set up a large projector, broadcasting the full recording with subtitles for everyone to understand. Amidst the thick air of anger, an elderly woman whispered, "They took my house back then. Now I know why." On social media, the hashtag #ExposePinewood trended. Student organizations from major universities launched petitions demanding federal investigations. Over 100,000 signatures were collected in less than 2 days. Also that day, Derek appeared on a late-night radio show. His voice was deep and clear. "I was once part of that system. I stayed silent, but no longer." He did not name anyone specifically, but confirmed there is a protection network, and it won't disappear unless we force it out. His last words before going off air were, "Truth chooses no side, it chooses the moment." And that moment had arrived. The atmosphere in Pinewood Grove no longer maintained the false calm of previous months. As soon as the confidential files were released, reactions from the state government surged like a shockwave. The State Federal Investigation Committee summoned numerous local officials, demanding testimonies about expenses linked to the relocation project and financial ties with the Civic Restoration League. The state attorney general, previously cautious, appeared before the press for the first time to declare a comprehensive review of land permitting and control procedures in Pinewood Grove. While public uproar grew, Police Chief Grover began appearing in a completely different light. He had previously defended Hans multiple times in closed meetings and even obstructed deeper internal investigations. Now, he held a press conference stating, "Some procedural errors in handling and information from the Department of Resources may have led to unintended consequences." Though the wording sounded neutral, it was an initial step to shift blame onto other departments, a way to distance himself from Hans, the man officially under investigation. However, Grover's behavior could not hide his unease. Some neutral officers began submitting transfer requests or temporary leaves, causing a sudden drop in the station's operational team. Meanwhile, a small group loyal to Grover held private meetings, but their isolation clearly weakened their control. Leaked internal messages revealed heated debates over who would be dragged down together. In the following days, Grover's unusual actions attracted more attention. He quietly cleared out his office without official leave notification. The station's IT manager discovered his attempts to erase data from his personal computer, including emails with an out-of-state financial organization. After data recovery efforts, the technical team found several critical files about emergency budget coordination and secret schedules with an unregistered legal representative. Maya closely monitored all developments. In an urgent meeting with the legal team and investigative reporters, she stated clearly, they are not trying to fix things. They are trying to retreat without leaving a trace. At the same time, Venn chaired a session with civil lawyers, demanding the preparation of files to file lawsuits if signs of public asset transfers or document destruction were found. No one doubted the legal battle had officially begun. Across the streets, residents pasted copies of an article titled "The Price of Silence," an exposé revealing how Grover and the system had once tolerated abuses for political goals and personal gain. Venn stood before a wall covered with these papers, silently watching people pass by. In his mind, anger was gone, replaced by a clear realization. This is when they see the true face of power, and once seen, no one can turn away anymore. The apartment was tucked away at the end of Laurel Street, in a row of boarding houses where the streetlights had been out for 2 weeks with no one coming to fix them. In front was a cracked concrete yard with wastewater dripping down daily from the floor above, leaving stains firmly clinging to the base of the walls. Mariah had just finished her shift. The smell of plastic from the warehouse still lingered on her collar. She carried a cheap bag of rice, her eyes dark and hollow from 2 consecutive nights of sleeping no more than 3 hours. Ben sat in a corner of the room, one hand holding a workbook, the other embracing his sister Aria, who had dozed off. The cramped room could barely fit 2 thin mattresses laid side by side. The ceiling light was weak, faint, like the stretched-out light of an afternoon that never quite reached night. Sounds from the hallway drifted in waves. Children crying, neighbors arguing, heavy footsteps of the woman upstairs returning late from work. Mariah sat on the edge of the bed, holding the camera without mounting it on the tripod. She knew in places like this, light was not to be imposed, and too much distance would turn the story into a news report. Mariah sipped water quietly and recounted the first time she received notice to leave the old apartment, the place where she had lived for 7 years, where Ben learned to walk and talk, the place he once called home. A paper was taped on the door, the handwriting cold and printed. Eviction due to luxury residential redevelopment effective within 30 days. No explanation, no support offered, just an order from a system that never looked at the worn shoes standing outside the door. The second time was when the old neighborhood was put on security alert, a pretext to raise rents and push out those who couldn't afford it. The third time, the landlord told her directly, "We were advised to prioritize more stable tenants." Mariah understood that stable meant white with long-term contracts, and no 3 children crying every night. Ben began suffering from insomnia then. He would stay up late holding Aria just to check if anyone unfamiliar approached the door. Once, Mariah saw him startled, mistaking a knock for the police coming to evict them, even though the apartment walls hadn't yet held their family photos. Aria was not spared either. She had once been questioned by a park officer who mistook her for a stray child while playing alone. The elderly woman watching her that day lacked proper identification. Mariah told her story without bitterness, her voice steady as if the words were lodged deep in her throat. She remembered each old neighbor's face, the elderly couple forced to sell their fully paid house, the single mother who couldn't find housing because her credit file was marked high risk. Every move meant Mariah had to take leave from work, Ben had to change schools, and Aria no longer knew which place to call home. Ben once had a best friend named Elijah, who was in 2nd grade and lived in the adjacent apartment. When they moved, they didn't have time to say goodbye. Elijah vanished along with the entire building overnight after bulldozers came to clear the area. Ben had not kept in contact with anyone for more than a few months. Whenever someone asked, the boy just shrugged. The way a child learns not to expect anything anymore pained Maya more than tears. Mariah refused aid for fear of being labeled. A colleague once sneered at her as a system parasite after seeing her application for Ben's tuition assistance. Since then, she worked night shifts, took on house-cleaning jobs, and only slept after her children had eaten, bathed, and the room returned to silence. When Maya asked why she did not leave Pinwood Grove, Mariah looked down at her rough hands and softly replied, "Because leaving would mean admitting I was wrong, and I never did anything wrong." She said she had grown used to being ignored, until that day when Ben was pulled down on the street and a man stepped forward, not because he was a soldier or black, Mariah said. eyes misty, but because for the first time someone didn't turn away, the filming ended in silence. Maya did not press with more questions, nor did she re-illuminate the scene. She knew, among hundreds of documents and clips she had collected, the story of a mother who once held her children in the dark was the strongest proof of a system that chose to push the weakest to the margins, then covered it with the guise of development. A light rain misted over the boarding house as Ven stopped his car before the water-stained hallway. He wore neither uniform nor fine coat, only carrying a paper bag of hot food and several old books wrapped carefully in nylon. Inside the apartment, Mariah nervously tugged at her shirt sleeve, trying to hide scratches on her wrist from carrying goods the day before. Arya whispered something to Ben, then hid behind her brother, while Ben stepped forward to open the door, his face expressionless, but his eyes full of curiosity. They said little at first. Ven sat on the floor, placing the bag before him as a silent greeting. Mariah poured water, her hand trembling slightly. Arya shyly hugged a pillow, and Ben leaned against the wall, silently watching the man who once stood between him and a police baton. When Ven spoke, he did not start with a question. He told of how, as a teenager, living with his mother in the southern state, he was once forced from home for not fitting the zoning plan. Then he spoke of the first man who helped his mother move without demanding payment, simply because she was a woman of dignity. At that moment, Ben moved closer and slowly sat down a short distance from him. "I'm afraid of the night," Ben whispered after a long pause, not looking at anyone. "I hate moving. It always feels like I did something wrong." Mariah was about to intervene, but Ven signaled with his eyes, gentle as a comfort. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. "You're just living in a place where too many people try to protect their mistakes by making others afraid." Arya crawled closer, doodling on an old notebook page. Moments later, she showed Ven a drawing of a tall man shielding two small children in front of a police car. Maya sat in a shadowy corner, the camera turned off, hands gripping the lens tightly, as if holding onto a moment no footage could buy back. The drawing appeared on social media the next afternoon, posted by Maya with the caption, "This boy didn't draw a hero, he drew what he most wanted to see, someone brave enough to stand up at the right time." The image spread widely like the video evidence, but this time the spread came from emotion, not outrage. Community organizations began calling Ben's school to offer long-term scholarships. A nearby public school principal sent a handwritten apology to the family for a lack of sensitivity in protecting vulnerable students. It was the first time Mariah received a letter from a school proposing cooperation rather than demanding identity verification. Ben did not speak in public, did not answer interviews, nor appear at press conferences. Yet images of him standing with his mother, holding Arya's hand, silently appeared at many marches. Signs with Arya's drawing were held high beneath the scribbled words of a child. "This is my big brother. Des is my big brother." Ven left the boarding house late in the afternoon, the sky still gloomy. On the way back to his temporary office, he turned onto the street where the incident with Hans had happened. The scene remained unchanged. Cracked bricks underfoot, the drugstore window cracked at the corner from impact. But now, someone had placed a bouquet of flowers at the door, accompanied by a handwritten note, "Thank you for standing still when all chose silence." In his coat pocket, Ven kept Arya's drawing. The paper was folded into quarters. Ink was still blotchy. He did not think himself a hero in the children's eyes, but he knew the image needed to exist. Not to be a hero for others, but to remind himself that if a child drew him as a shield, the real mission had begun the moment he did not turn away. Ben still lived in that apartment, still went to school the next morning as usual, but this time he walked without lowering his head, and in that silence, a town was learning to face itself. The internal meeting room on the third floor of the Pinewood Grove police station had never felt as tense as that day. There were no sirens, no gunshots, yet the atmosphere was heavy, as if a murder was about to happen. The internal security captain entered carrying a thick file. his eyes barely resting on anyone for more than 3 seconds. He spoke one crisp sentence: "We have a rat." A few dry laughs echoed, then died away as the video file was played. The night camera showed a shadow entering the digital records warehouse late at night, standing still for about 5 minutes before disappearing. The image was blurry, but the figure was tall, with broad shoulders and a slight limp to the left. That was enough for several pairs of eyes to exchange looks. Derek sat silently, barely breathing. He knew the figure was likely him, even though he had never been in that exact room. But since he had been in the nearby area transferring archived data the previous week, combined with taking leave on the same day the video leaked, he had no way to clear himself of suspicion. Worse, Officer Luis, who had stood alongside him on many night shifts, was called in separately. When Luis returned, his face was pale. He said nothing, not even glancing at Derek once. That silence spoke louder than any accusation. By afternoon, Derek was summoned to the internal interrogation room. There was no official warrant and no lawyer present, yet every question implied guilt. "Have you contacted the press? Why were you near the data warehouse that night? Why did you take leave on the exact day the video was released?" He answered each question steadily, without wavering, but that calm was seen as a sign of preparation. A young officer, recently transferred from another county, quietly placed handcuffs on Derek as he stood, though no order was given. Leaving the room, he sensed an invisible distance in every gaze. No one sat beside him during dinner in the break room. When changing out of uniform to leave, someone patted his shoulder but avoided eye contact. A hoarse voice from the corner said, "I thought he was one of us." No one responded, but no one disagreed either. That night, Derek came home later than usual. On the doorstep lay a neatly placed white paper with bold black letters. "Snitch." He picked it up, hands trembling. His wife and daughter were asleep inside, unaware that their safety might already be shaken just because he had chosen to stand for what was right. He sat all night before his darkened computer screen. His resignation letter had been drafted days before but never sent. The denials, the bowing heads, the ignoring of wrongdoing played on repeat like a film. The first time he saw Hans hit a skinny black teenager behind the gas station, Derek had planned to speak up, but he stayed silent. The second time, he turned away. The third, he forced a smile to get through it. Each time, he lost a bit more trust in himself. Near dawn, his phone vibrated. The number was unknown. He answered without a word. Maya's voice came through, steady and clear. "If you disappear now, no one inside will speak up." Derek did not reply, but he knew the decision was already forming, not because of Maya or Ven, but because, finally, he could no longer face himself in the mirror. The next morning, Derek put on his uniform for the last time. His shirt was neatly pressed, the badge pinned correctly on the left chest, but the pride usually in his eyes was gone. His steps were heavy, not from fear, but knowing that behind that door there would be no turning back. He walked straight into headquarters without looking at anyone or stopping by the break room as usual. Inside the meeting room, 6 people were seated: the deputy security chief, the head of human resources, the internal affairs representative, and 3 men he had once considered teammates. On the table lay a copy of the night camera footage and a sealed red envelope labeled "Suspension Account." Derek did not sit. He pulled a folded resignation letter from his inside pocket. "I will not wait for the investigation's conclusion. I resign from this force." He placed the letter on the table, his voice steady and firm. "Not because I am wrong, but because I no longer want to stand beside things I cannot believe in." The deputy asked if he understood the consequences. Derek nodded. The internal affairs representative reminded him that a voluntary resignation would offer no legal protection if criminal elements emerged later. He nodded again. The last to speak was the police chief, who had only observed quietly. He asked, "Do you want to be a hero?" Derek looked straight at him. "I want to be real." He He left the meeting room without looking back. At the parking lot, a reporter waited. The news had leaked. Derek did not avoid it. He agreed to an interview. The conversation took place in a park several blocks from headquarters. He shared no details, made no mention of Maya or Van. He only said that he had once believed in the badge, thought the mistakes were isolated incidents. But then he understood that the system does not fail without accomplices. "Do you regret it?" the reporter asked. "Yes," he answered, "because I spent too long not daring to do what was right." Within hours, the interview video spread online. Half the viewers called him a traitor, exploiting the media for fame. The other half saw him as a beacon of hope from inside the system. But Derek cared little for either side. What mattered was that no longer was his sleep interrupted by torment. That night, Ven sent him a brief message. True courage needs no audience. Maya appeared at his doorstep soon after. She said no thanks, but handed him a USB containing unreleased data, the internal coordination logs of the Civic Restoration League, including names of people who had met Hans and the town's command. "This needs someone from inside the system to verify," she said, "and now you have nothing left to lose." Derek nodded. The freedom of no longer hiding anything made his breathing easier. He still lived in town, but was a different Derek. Not a police officer, not a secret source, but a man who had cut the reins from his own back. The next day, he walked to the neighborhood where Ben's incident had occurred. He passed slowly by the gas station and the grocery store where he used to ignore complaints. Beneath the corner tree where Hans had once dragged Ven onto the sidewalk, Derek stood quietly. A teenage boy rode by, recognized him, paused briefly, then nodded in greeting. Derek smiled and returned the gesture gently. For the first time in years wearing the uniform, he truly felt he belonged here, not because of the shirt, but because of the choice. Late in the afternoon, Maya left a closed-door meeting with the federal investigation team feeling tired but relieved. The 3-hour assessment confirmed that most of the documents she and Ven had gathered were sufficient to expand the investigation to the state level. She drove out of the city under a fading sunset, following a quiet road back to Pinewood Grove. The wind blew across the dry fields on both sides, rustling like a reminder that the place she returned to was still far from safe. As the car descended a slope, Maya lightly pressed the brake to slow down, but her foot slipped. The pedal sank without response. She tried again, harder. Still nothing. The car began to accelerate uncontrollably, tires screeching, alarms sounding as she tried to steer sharply right to avoid a bend ahead. She leaned forward, turning the wheel, but inertia refused to obey. The collision came suddenly. Her car slid off the road, crashing into a metal fence by the ditch, spinning before stopping in mud and scattered gravel. No one witnessed it. Only the sound of metal groaning and the engine sputtering remained. The airbag deployed just in time to prevent a head injury, but the shoulder was squeezed hard, leaving Maya gasping. Panic. It was only when a passing couple called emergency services that help arrived. They thought she had dozed off while driving until rescuers found evidence that the brake line had been tampered with. Ven arrived at the hospital late that night. Maya was kept for observation with no internal injuries, but her spirit was completely shaken. He asked no questions in the hospital room, only sat by the bedside holding the stack of documents she had not yet fully submitted. When she opened her eyes, the first words she said were, "They know we're close now." The next morning, Ven took the car to an old acquaintance, Jackson, a former military technician who now ran a small garage in town. Less than 2 hours later, Jackson confirmed. The brake line had been cut with a specialized knife, the cut covered with anti-rust paint designed to fail gradually, not immediately. A calculated, covert assassination method with timing and precision. That evening, Ven, Maya, and Derek met at Ven's mother's house. No electronics, no internet. The old kitchen became a strategy room. Maya was quieter than usual, her gaze heavy rather than sharp as before. Derek said what everyone was thinking. They have switched from defense to elimination. No one disagreed. Ven looked at Maya for a long time, then said slowly, "This is not a warning. This is a message. Stop here. If you go further, they won't just cut brake lines." Maya bowed her head, gripping a cold cup of tea. She had been threatened, spammed, and followed, but no one had wanted her dead until now. When it happens, everything changes. The fear no longer comes from gunfire, but from the feeling that one's life could be decided without anyone knowing. News of the accident was never made public, but the support team knew well. A few members withdrew, citing health reasons. One asked to remain anonymous in the documents. Venn did not blame them. He knew not everyone chose to pay the price. That night, Maya stepped into the backyard. The car lay silent inside the small garage, the lower part still untouched. She touched the cut spot, silent for a long moment. She did not cry, she did not tremble, but for the first time on this journey, her eyes carried a new layer, cold and determined, not because she was not afraid to die, but because she understood. If she did not move forward, all the spilled blood would be meaningless. The preliminary hearing at the county court was supposed to be a formality, confirming eligibility to proceed with the civil lawsuit filed by Venn, accusing Pinewood Grove police of abuse of power and covering up violence. But that morning, when Venn's legal team entered the courtroom, they received a thick envelope from the court clerk. Inside was a notice of postponement, citing the reason: lack of valid confirmation from the State Department of Justice regarding some digital evidence. Maya immediately checked the files. All documents had been submitted on time, with signatures and electronic security codes. Claiming lack of confirmation was illogical, unless someone deliberately interfered at the verification level. Within 24 hours, a new group of lawyers appeared, claiming to be sent by the state government to assist with re-verification. In legal circles, this was no different than bringing the opposition's people to find faults in the plaintiff's case. Venn sat silently in his office upon receiving the information. He had seen similar tactics in the military, when misconduct files were adjusted to protect commanding officers. But this time, he was the one being obstructed halfway, even as he moved closer to justice. In the following sessions, the verification lawyers began questioning the origins of the recordings Maya collected. An internal video showing Hans ordering to deal quickly with those stubborn black guys was shelved, citing lack of authenticity of the recorder. An email from a superior officer was rejected for no system verification. Evidence, once considered milestones, were sequentially removed from the valid list. Eric, regarded as the strongest internal witness, was summoned to testify, but instead of questioning him about the content he provided, opposing lawyers shifted focus to attack his motives. They emphasized his resignation and past internal investigations, implying he held personal grudges against the system, making his testimony biased. Though he stood firm, his credibility was somewhat shaken under the judge's skeptical gaze. Maya grew impatient. She slammed her hand on the table when a piece of evidence was rejected only because it lacked a timestamp confirmation. Her lawyer held her back, whispering, "They are pushing you to lose control to justify dismissing the entire case." She knew it was true, but could not swallow the anger seeing each piece of truth torn apart by cold technicalities. Faced with this, Venn refused to continue playing by a twisted law. He organized a press conference at the community center without inviting mainstream media. Instead, he invited independent journalists, civil rights representatives, and live-streamed on an open platform. During the event, he spoke less about the lawsuit and more about something greater. The legal system is born to protect justice, but when justice becomes a burden, the system will try to eliminate those who carry it. The press conference clip spread widely, garnering over 2 million views in 2 days. Some applauded Venn's determination, but many began doubting. If the evidence is that strong, why was it dismissed? Pro-government media quickly exploited this, suggesting Venn's group was manipulating public opinion to cover a lack of legal grounds. Facing the risk of the lawsuit being crushed from within, Maya and Venn decided to split all original evidence, encrypt it, and send it to international organizations, out-of-state oversight agencies, and some neutral legislators. This meant all data would become public property, uncontrollable by any media, but also no longer able to be held for review. On the last night before sending the data, Maya looked at her computer screen, then at Ven. We are betting the entire case on the hope that when truth is clear enough, it no longer needs permission. Ven replied in a whisper, as if speaking to himself. Either it will win justice or force the entire system to expose itself. Ven stepped out of the bus station in D.C., the early sunlight casting slanting rays through rows of buildings draped with flags. Quiet, yet steadfast. Maya walked beside him, a backpack over her shoulder, her hand gripping tightly a stack of documents, encrypted and carefully packaged. The silence between them was not due to a lack of words, but because both knew the road ahead was not for idle talk. General Bradwick awaited them in a small office deep within the Department of Homeland Security's Coordination Center. Ven saw the silvering hair of his old comrade, and in that moment of their handshake, memories of Afghanistan surfaced. Gunfire, sleepless nights, and how they survived only by trusting each other. Yet today's battle was not in the desert, but within America's streets and corridors of power. "What's serious enough to pull you away from Pinewood Grove?" Bradwick asked, eyes briefly passing over the old swelling on Ven's cheekbone. Ven did not answer immediately, but gestured for Maya to step forward. She opened her backpack, placing documents, memory cards, and recording devices on the table. Without introduction, the evidence spoke for itself. Internal recordings of unlawful detention orders, videos of police laughing after insulting a child, and land contracts coinciding with the forced removal of black residents from their neighborhoods. Bradwick turned the pages slowly but with intent. Silence lingered until he set the files down and looked Ven directly in the eyes. "What do you want from me?" "Not a media punch," Ven replied in a deep, steady voice. "I want an institutional presence. A military advisory group was sent to Pinewood Grove under the pretense of assessing regional security. No public announcement, but with enough authority to shake up the internal control system there." Bradwick did not agree right away. He glanced at Maya as if needing to hear the younger generation's voice. "Are you certain what you've provided is authentic? I've been tracking this case for 2 years. If what I've recorded isn't authentic, then nothing in this system is trustworthy," Maya answered firmly, without lowering her gaze. Bradwick stepped back, arms crossed, eyes drifting along the curtain-covered windows. "You know, some things I cannot do openly," he said. "But I owe you something, and I owe this country more," Ven said, nodding. That nod was not one of victory, but a confirmation. This battle had entered a new level, beyond local boundaries. Bradwick took out his phone, made a brief call, using the phrase temporarily assigned mission to monitor civilian situation at the district level. Not a word was mentioned about Pinewood Grove, but all three understood the real meaning behind it. Before parting, Braddock grasped Ven's shoulder, eyes deeper and murkier than before. "I once told you that clear enemies are easier to handle than the hatred seeping quietly within this land. Now I see I was right." Ven squeezed his shoulder lightly, then walked down the corridor with Maya. They needed no more words. The silent backing from one of the military's most powerful positions was now engaged in the gears of this battle. A small step, but the foundation for something greater, forcing the system to look at itself. They were led down a narrow hallway, cold white light patching the gray stone floor. Mendez did not meet them in a conference room or office, but in a specially soundproofed space with thick walls lined with anti-recording material. Every detail in the room seemed to say one thing: this place was for conversations not found on any record. Lieutenant General Mendez sat waiting, his face carved from stone, eyes not cold but utterly unreadable. After a formal handshake, he motioned briefly for the escort to leave. The door closed, no sound penetrated, no gaze could enter. "What you're uncovering in Pinewood Grove," Mendez said, "is just the tip of the iceberg." He took an encrypted hard drive from his pocket and plugged it into an internal security device. A screen lit up, showing a map dotted with bright points across the southern and midwestern states. Each point marked a town, linked with data files, classified notes, budget allocations, police staffing charts, and anomaly reports. "We call it blue uniform," he continued. "They don't use special insignia, don't wear different badges, but they are selected, trained, and embedded. Their goal is control through amplifying fear. Pinewood Grove is their testing ground. Maya sat silent. She had heard rumors, suspected, but this was the first time someone like Mendez confirmed it. Ven gripped his hand tightly, eyes fixed on the screen as Mendez opened another document. A list of money flowing from a nonprofit named Citizens for Secure Communities. Under the guise of community, the real goal is manipulation, Mendez said. The man behind this fund was once a gubernatorial candidate, nearly winning the last election. He convinced local governments to cooperate, turning police into semi-armed political forces. The next file revealed familiar faces, the Pinewood Grove police chief, then Hans, plus 5 other names from 3 neighboring towns. Ven felt his chest grow heavy. He once thought he was facing a corrupt group, but the truth showed a structured system, invested in, protected, and nurtured. Mendez looked straight at him. I've coordinated domestic crackdowns. Some far-right groups were ready to open fire on civilians to prove their power. And, I'll be honest with you, Ven, if you keep going, they won't keep up appearances anymore. Maya leaned forward. Are you planning to stop us? No, Mendez replied. I'm not stopping you, but I can't intervene directly. This is beyond the military's scope. He pulled out a sealed envelope and handed it to Ven. Inside is the file on a civilian strategic advisor. She's worked in El Paso and Ferguson. I'll have her accompany Maya from now on. She's unarmed, but she's got the courage. Ven took it, putting it in his jacket pocket. No need for more questions or thanks. In that room, every gesture carried weight, and silence was an ally. As they left the secure area, daylight poured onto the long corridor, causing them to squint. Maya walked slowly beside Ven, her hand still gripping the worn strap of her backpack. They think we don't know how deep this goes, she said softly. Ven said nothing. He knew that from that moment the battle had moved beyond a single town, becoming a clash between 2 opposing visions. Under the gray sky of a damp afternoon, hundreds began gathering at the main square of Pinewood Grove. Initially, familiar faces from the black community appeared. A mother who had lost her child to police violence, veterans who faced discrimination upon reintegration, teachers, students, and working-class citizens. Soon, unfamiliar faces emerged from neighboring towns, nearby cities, and even the capital. Each person carried a sign, a message, or a personal grievance. Social media had played its part. After Maya released documents revealing the manipulation network of the blue uniforms, independent platforms ignited waves of outrage. Videos once clipped by local media were now shared intact, highlighting Ven's assault and Ben's testimony as focal points. The hashtag Justice for Pinewood quickly trended, accompanied by countless posts, images, and calls to action from human rights organizations and influencers. In a widely circulated clip, a young black woman spoke before the camera with a trembling voice. I used to fear the police, but now I fear our own silence even more. That phrase was echoed on banners, t-shirts, and coffee shop windows. Protests erupted beyond Pinewood Grove. In 3 major cities within the state, citizens took to the streets in unprecedented numbers since the last election. They marched before city halls, police stations, and state government offices. Unlike past impulsive reactions, this wave was well organized, featuring legal teams, medical support, live stream monitoring systems, and internal conflict control units to maintain order. Long-established civil organizations, such as the NAACP, ACLU, and the Southern Poverty Law Center, jointly signed petitions demanding comprehensive investigations into towns influenced by the blue uniforms. Notably, the list included over 30 veterans, many of whom had served alongside Ven and several retired military lawyers. The petition amassed over 1 million signatures within 48 hours. Mainstream media could no longer turn a blind eye. Pressure from the community and overwhelming numbers forced them to adjust their stance. The state's largest news channel hosted a live interview with Ven, allowing him to speak unedited for the first time. When asked if he felt isolated in this fight, Ven looked into the camera and replied, "If standing for what is right makes me alone, it is not because I am wrong. It is because we do not yet have enough right people standing together." That response was clipped into a short video, spreading like wildfire across platforms. Those who hesitated began to side with him, not just because Venn was a victim, but because he voiced what many had thought but dared not admit. The impact reached the political arena. Some state legislators close to the conservative faction were compelled to speak out. Under voter pressure, they demanded a public hearing on the situation in Pinewood Grove. Whispers of a statewide inquiry circulated through government halls like a silent drum, heralding an impending institutional battle. Amid all this turmoil, Venn stood on the sidelines, watching the crowd pass. He held no megaphone, stepped no stage, nor gave additional speeches. He merely stood, a living witness, listening to the sound of a community beginning to find its voice. And this time, the world listened. That morning, before the Baptist church on Main Street, a silver-haired woman stood amid the gathering crowd. Her name was Helen Carter, 81 years old, having lived in Pinewood Grove since it was a rustic logging town. She held a handwritten sign. "I apologized for being silent too long." The shaky but clear handwriting mirrored her voice as she spoke. "I used to think I was blameless, but now I know that seeing wrong and saying nothing makes me part of that wrong." Her sign was photographed and posted online an hour later, becoming a symbol of awakening among the white community in Pinewood Grove. For years, most had remained neutral or silent to avoid trouble, but the assault on Venn and the uncovered truth about the extremist police network changed everything. They could no longer pretend ignorance. At Pinewood High School, a group of white teachers held a private sharing session. Annette, who had taught Ben's class, tearfully admitted she had witnessed black students treated more harshly, but avoided intervention out of fear of losing her job. "We are adults," she said. "If we do not teach by example, lessons on fairness are empty words." Students recorded her statement, sharing it online as a courageous voice of self-reflection. That evening, at the Interfaith Church on the town's east side, an unprecedented prayer service took place. Black and white pastors stood together, leading prayers for justice and truth. Hands once hesitant now clasped tightly, forming a circle around the altar. There was no sermon, only silence. Profound and grateful, Ben sat beside his mother, while Venn and Maya quietly observed from the back row. Tears fell, not from sorrow, but because for the first time, the town knew what empathy meant. The next morning, a 10-minute video was posted featuring Tim Holloway, a former white police officer who had worked under the current chief. He recounted hidden incidents, orders from superiors to look the other way, and warnings he received for being too friendly with minority communities. "I can no longer stay silent," he said. "I used to believe I served justice, but justice does not command silencing the honest." The chain reaction began. A group of parents in Pinewood Grove, mostly white mothers, wrote letters to state officials demanding protection for students of color in schools. Rachel, a mother, shared how her son was banned from playing with Ben because his family causes trouble. "I don't know how many apologies are enough," she said on her personal live stream, "but I know if I don't speak up today, I'm teaching my child to stay silent." The town's oldest barber shop, once displaying portraits of white governors, suddenly changed its sign to "All who respect justice are welcome." That simple slogan sparked an unexpectedly long line of customers. No one came for a haircut. They came to say, "I stand with him." Venn recognized this movement was not sparked by a speech, a lawsuit, or a retaliation. It came from small changes in people's hearts. Not everyone changed, but some stepped across the boundary, not because they were forced, but because they chose to. On the bus ride home, Ben asked his mother, "Do they really understand, Mom?" She smiled, hugging his shoulder. "No one understands everything, but if they stand with us without needing an explanation, that is the beginning of hope." Under the dim yellow light in the office, Maya focused on the screen, scrolling through old data. An unusual code, M99, Response Assessment. caught her attention. This phrase had been mentioned in an internal report related to models manipulating social order. She carefully traced every lead. After multiple layers of anonymity, a chain of accounts linked to Hans appeared, all receiving regular payments from the Civic Restoration League. At first glance, it resembled a community group, but it had no website, no budget reports, and no recorded social activities for 3 years. Maya recalled a clip from a secret meeting at a luxury resort she had found during another investigation. She zoomed in on the back row and saw Hans, sitting silently, next to a man in a gray jacket whose face was obscured. The accompanying documents identified the event as the Advisory Conference on Deep Region Civil Security. She called Derek, who asked, "Are you ready to know the rest?" He then sent a recording from an internal meeting of commanders and selected officers. A deep voice said, "Hans is thoroughly instructed. He doesn't need to understand the whole model, just keep the reaction hot so it happens at the right place at the right time." This confirmed that Hans was not a rogue individual, but a trained, funded tool executing a designed social strategy. Maya compared the recording with the green uniform organizational model from the classified files Mendez had shared. Pinewood Grove was no exception. It was a testing ground. Hans, once feared as a menace, was now a mere pawn. At the office, Venn looked at the new line on the board. Hans equals experimental tool. He turned to the balcony as the wind scattered papers on the table, but no one bothered to pick them up. For the first time, they understood they were fighting a system, not a person. Shaken by the discovery of the Civic Restoration League, Maya traced those behind the fund. She dug into shadowy political contributions from other states. One name emerged, Graham Whitlow, a former state senator who ran for governor with the slogan, "Real Order for America." Whitlow was known for a tough security policy, having proposed increasing police powers in small towns at risk of social disorder. The plan was opposed and shelved, but now Maya found he had turned Pinewood Grove into an unofficial testing ground. Using voice analysis software, Maya matched Whitlow's public speeches with the recording Derek sent. Key words like keep heat, reaction, and deep region order matched perfectly, with a 98.4% voice similarity. A leaked internal email from a former Whitlow campaign assistant, sent anonymously to Maya, revealed, "If Pinewood reacts as modeled, we will replicate before the election." Replicate clearly meant expanding the strategy to control minority communities by escalating conflicts with police to justify intervention. When Maya published this independently, public outrage erupted. Major media outlets couldn't ignore it. The creator of Pinewood became a widespread headline. Whitlow's major donors withdrew rapidly, and many politicians denied any links. At the state government, numerous investigation requests were sent to the Department of Justice. A special committee was formed to examine possible federal violations related to misusing campaign funds. Back at the office, Maya erased Hans equals experimental trigger and wrote Whitlow equals system designer, adding a question, who authorized this? Venn stood silently, understanding they had unveiled the biggest mask, but opened a deeper door into the system. The mastermind was revealed, but what about those silent around him? The story did not end with finding the puppeteer. It moved from darkness into light, where the truth could no longer be hidden. That is where the real battle began. Under the harsh lights of the state hearing room, the atmosphere grew dense. Hundreds of eyes tracked every movement as Venn stepped up to the witness stand. Each step echoed through the space, carrying the weight of truth and justice. Hans, summoned as a witness, sat not far away. His face was pale, eyes avoiding contact, no longer bearing his usual arrogance. When asked to speak, Hans stammered, admitting his connection to the Civic Restoration League and his role in forcibly evicting black residents. He tried to shift the blame onto his superiors and justified that he was only following orders. Venn began his statement in a deep, powerful voice. He recounted the evidence collection process, from confidential documents to conversations with witnesses. He did not single out individuals but emphasized the rot within the system that allowed wrongdoing to persist. "We cannot continue to hide the truth under the carpet of power," he declared. When asked about his wishes, Venn did not call for personal punishment, but proposed a comprehensive reform. He called for establishing an independent committee to oversee police activities, restructuring the justice system, and ensuring transparency in land management. "We need to rebuild trust, not with words but with concrete actions," he concluded. The hearing ended in profound silence. No applause followed, but everyone's eyes shone with respect and hope. Outside, crowds gathered quietly, listening to Venn's words broadcast over loudspeakers. As he walked out, they made way for him, forming an honorable path. The next day, major newspapers simultaneously published Venn's speech. Lawmakers began discussing reform proposals. A wave of change spread across the state, sparked by the sincere and courageous words of a man who chose to stand up for justice. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story. We don't just tell what happened. We aim to spark reflection, honesty, and courage in every viewer. Have you ever been misjudged simply because someone didn't take the time to understand you? Have you ever felt underestimated, overlooked, yet quietly proved that you're far more capable than they assumed? Behind every dismissive glance, every biased remark, lies an opportunity to stand up and reshape how society values human dignity. This story isn't just about one person. It's about all of us who have been silenced, sidelined, and are now choosing to speak up. If you see yourself in any part of this journey, share this video so more people can reflect and learn. You might be the reason someone regains their courage, their voice, or simply receives the encouragement they need. Thank you for staying with us. We're committed to bringing you the most powerful, thought-provoking stories possible. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring journeys. Justice doesn't begin with judgment. It begins with understanding.